Hey kids, Graham here from therecordingrevolution.com with another 5 minutes to a better mix tutorial. We're looking at 31 mixing tips in 31 days, and you know I'm going to start this entire series off with a bunch of foundational tips before we get into the real specific stuff, because that's the most important thing. How you think about mixing will shape the way you mix, will shape the way your mixes turn out in the end. So we've been looking at really foundational stuff. If it's not new to you, well, you got to ask yourself, are you actually implementing this stuff? Do you actually mix this way, or have you just heard this and were like me for many years, ignored the advice to your own peril? Because I don't want you to do that. Here's another foundational one before we jump into some specific stuff moving forward, and that is you have to pretend that the solo button in your DAW on your console does not exist. You have to avoid the solo button at all costs, because the solo button is so pointless, okay? It is so pointless for what you're trying to do for most mixing. Now, you need to be able to solo things to just zero in on an instrument to see, hey, is this instrument making some noise that I don't need? Was there like bleed on this instrument? We looked at obviously some phase checking with the drums real quick. But other than some institutional utility type uses, the solo button is pointless for making really concrete mix decisions, because you're not mixing a solo instrument. You're mixing a mix of other tracks. It's a band, or it's an instrumental piece, or it's an orchestra, or whatever it is. What matters is, how does it sound when they're all playing together, when all the tracks are playing together? That is the most important thing. And trust me when I say this, you can mix the crud out of a snare drum or a bass guitar or a lead vocal in solo, and that means nothing to how that track is going to sound in the mix. It just means absolutely nothing. So I don't want you to waste your time mixing with a track in solo and saying, let's get the bass to sound good, so I'll solo the bass. Let's get the kick drum to sound good, so I'll solo the kick drum. We do this. We do this because it's easier to listen when there's no other tracks competing for our attention. But do you understand that that is also the biggest reason why your mixes might sound horrible right now? Because you don't know how to mix a track to sound good with all the competing tracks. You say, oh, but I can't hear the lead vocal and all the other tracks, or that guitar gets buried with all the other guitars, so how do I know how to EQ it? That's your problem. If it's buried, you need to EQ it or compress it differently so that it's not buried, but you only can know that if it's in context with everything else. You have to avoid the solo button at all costs. And you'll hate it, because I hate it, and I want to just, for some reason, solo it and go, let me get the guitar to sound great. But here's what happens. Here's a track right now where, again, we're looking at foundational stuff, and it's a really simple example. But I have only 2 guitars, okay? And I need those guitars to sound nice and full together. So here's a lead guitar solo thing happening. But I really only have 2 guitars. This is the only guitar holding down the chords. To me, that sounds pretty thin. It sounds kind of weak, by itself. And if I were to just solo that track, I would probably EQ it to be fatter, thicker, and beefier. But that would be pointless, because then it would just become a muddied mess in the mix, when all I need is for it to cut through, be clear enough so that I can hear and perceive the chords, and fit in with everything else, where the bass is happening in the low end and the lead guitar part is happening in the right, just cutting through the mix. So you can see, just with a really brief example, if I were to zero in and solo something, I would really be making things harder for myself, and I'm mixing blind. What is the point of making any EQ decisions to a track if you're not listening to it in relation to the tracks that it'll ultimately be played and pitted against, okay? Please, please, please trust me on this one. When you go to mix your next track, think about stopping yourself from wanting to click that solo button on a track, and try to force yourself to EQ and compress and mix when you're listening to it in context with everything else, okay? It's just as hard as EQing in mono like we looked at yesterday. It's not fun, but it's what you need to do to get a great sounding mix. Again, this is Graham here at therecordingrevolution.com trying to help you guys out with practical advice. 5 minutes to a better mix is going to keep going, so hang with us. We'll see you on tomorrow's video.